There is a story so old that no one knows exactly when it began. It existed before the first written copy of it, before the alphabet that eventually captured it, before the civilization that eventually studied it. Somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, probably around 3,000 years ago, a poet, or many poets, or a tradition of poets, began telling a story about a man trying to get home. And something about that story refused to die. Tonight, as you settle in, that story is about to be told again. Not for the first time, not for the 100th time, but for the 10,000th time, at least. In living rooms, in theaters, in classrooms, in libraries, in languages that didn't exist when the story was first sung aloud to an audience sitting around a fire in ancient Greece. Christopher Nolan is making a film of it. That alone tells you something. Nolan does not choose small subjects. He spent years circling the ideas of time and memory in Memento, dreams in Inception, nuclear destruction in Oppenheimer. And now he is turning to a poem that is approximately 2,800 years old, written in a language almost nobody speaks anymore, about a world that has been buried under centuries of archaeology and interpretation. He is not doing this because it is a safe bet. He is doing this because the Odyssey is, by almost any measure, the most durable adventure story the human imagination has ever produced. So before you see what Nolan does with it, before the trailers, before the casting announcements, before the first frame of film, it seems worth knowing the real thing. The original. The one that started all of it. This is that story. And it begins, as the poem itself begins, not with a ship setting sail, not with a monster, or a goddess, or a storm. It begins with a man who is not there. Chapter 1. The promise of the title. Homer opens the Odyssey with a single word in the original Greek. Andra. It means man. Tell me, the poet asks, of the man of many ways. The man of twists and turns. Some translators render it resourceful. Some say cunning. Some say much traveled. The ancient Greek word is polytropos, and it contains inside it the entire character of the hero the poem is about to describe. Someone who has been shaped by travel, changed by experience. Someone whose identity is not fixed but flexible. Someone who survives not through brute strength, but through adaptability and intelligence. That is the first thing the Odyssey tells you about itself. It is not a story about the strongest man. It is a story about the smartest one. And that distinction, which would have been immediately obvious to any ancient Greek listener, is still immediately obvious to anyone who encounters this poem today, because we still live in a world that admires strength, but ultimately rewards cleverness. The Odyssey is 24 books long in its traditional division. It contains approximately 12,000 lines of Greek verse. It was composed in dactylic hexameter, a rhythmic pattern so precise and so musical that even in translation you can sometimes feel the pulse of it underneath the English words, the way a heartbeat persists beneath a piece of clothing. But none of that technical detail is why the poem has survived. The Odyssey has survived because it is, at its core, about something every human being understands without needing it explained. It is about being far from home. It is about wanting to return. It is about the gap between the person who left and the person who eventually comes back. It is about what happens to the people who wait, and whether waiting is a form of faithfulness or a form of suffering, or in some quietly devastating way, both at the same time. Every culture on Earth has a version of this story. The wanderer who cannot find the way back. The family held in suspension, neither mourning nor celebrating, frozen in a kind of limbo between loss and hope. The return that, when it finally comes, is complicated and strange, and not quite what anyone imagined. Homer told this story better than anyone before him, and, many would argue, better than anyone since. That is a strong claim. But 3,000 years of continuous readership is a reasonable piece of evidence. What Nolan recognized, what any serious artist who comes to this material eventually recognizes, is that the Odyssey is not a relic. It is not a museum piece. It is not a story preserved in amber for scholars to examine. It is a living text, which is to say, it changes slightly each time it is read, because the reader brings to it whatever they are carrying at the moment they open it. A soldier returning from a long deployment reads it differently than a student encountering it for the first time. A parent separated from their children reads it differently than a young person who has never been far from home. That elasticity, that capacity to mean different things to different people at different moments in their lives, is what makes a story genuinely great. And the Odyssey has it in abundance. So let's begin at the beginning. Not with Odysseus on a raft in the middle of the ocean, which is where the poem itself actually begins. Let's begin earlier. Let's begin with the world that produced this story, and the man at its center, and the catastrophic 10-year war that set him adrift. Chapter 2. The world Homer inhabited. No one knows for certain who Homer was. This is not a dramatic admission. It is simply true, and it has been true for a long time. The ancient Greeks themselves debated it. 7 different cities in the ancient world claimed to be his birthplace. Various ancient sources described him as blind. Others disputed even that. There was a tradition, still sometimes called the Homeric question, that debated whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed by one person or many, whether Homer was a single poet of genius or a convenient name attached to a long tradition of oral composition. Modern scholars tend to believe that whatever Homer was, the poems attributed to him represent the culmination of a very long tradition of oral poetry. Bards who traveled from community to community, performing epic poems from memory, improvising within established patterns, gradually refining and expanding the stories over generations. If Homer was one person, he was likely the one who gave these accumulated stories their final, definitive shape. The person who turned a tradition into a masterpiece. The world these poems emerged from was the Greek Bronze Age and its immediate aftermath, a period of remarkable and sometimes violent transformation in the Eastern Mediterranean, roughly spanning the period between 1200 and 800 BCE. The great palace civilizations of the Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the various cultures of the Levant and Cyprus, had collapsed in a wave of destruction and disruption that historians still do not fully understand. Cities were abandoned. Writing systems were lost. Trade networks fell apart. And then, slowly, a new world emerged from that collapse. Iron replaced bronze. New alphabets replaced lost syllabic scripts. The polis, the Greek city-state, began to take shape. And out of the memory of the Bronze Age world, filtered through centuries of oral tradition and poetic elaboration, came the Homeric epics. Poems set in a heroic past that the Greeks of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE already regarded as ancient and semi-mythological. This matters for understanding the Odyssey because the poem exists in a fascinating kind of double time. It is set in a version of the Bronze Age Aegean, a world of kings and warriors, bronze weapons and wooden ships, gods who walk among mortals and intervene in human affairs as casually as neighbors leaning over a fence. But it was composed by and for people who lived centuries later, who already understood that world as the past, who brought to it all the complexity and reflection that comes from distance. The geography of the Odyssey is similarly layered. Some of the places Odysseus visits are real. Ithaca is a real island, still there in the Ionian Sea off the western coast of Greece. Troy, or at least a city that historians believe may be the Troy of the poems, was excavated in the 19th century in what is now northwestern Turkey. But many of the places in the Odyssey are not real in any cartographic sense. They are somewhere else, somewhere in the mythological imagination of the ancient Mediterranean, perhaps loosely based on sailors' tales of the Western Mediterranean, perhaps entirely invented, perhaps a mixture of real geographical features transformed by the poetic tradition into something stranger and more significant. The ancient Greeks understood this distinction perfectly well. They knew the difference between historical places and mythological ones. What they believed, and what the Odyssey asks its audience to believe, is that Odysseus's journey took him through both, that the real Aegean world and the world of gods and monsters existed simultaneously, overlapping in ways that only heroes and their divine patrons could fully perceive. For a modern audience, this requires a small adjustment. We are accustomed to stories that stay on one side of that line, either realistic or fantastical. The Odyssey does not stay on one side. It moves freely between them, and the power of the poem depends on that freedom. The monsters are real. The gods are real. The homesickness is real. All of it occupies the same narrative space, and somehow, in Homer's hands, this does not feel contradictory. It feels true. This was the world that produced the poem. Now let's look at the man the poem is about. Chapter 3. Who was Odysseus? If you placed all the heroes of Greek mythology side by side and asked someone to pick out Odysseus, they would probably get it wrong on the first try. He does not look like what we imagine when we imagine a hero. He is not the tallest. He is not the most beautiful. He is not the strongest. Achilles, who dominates the Iliad, is described as almost supernaturally gifted in battle, faster than other men, deadlier, burning with a kind of divine ferocity that makes him terrifying to watch. Ajax is enormous, powerful, a wall of muscle and armor. Agamemnon carries the authority of kingship and the weight of command. Odysseus, by contrast, is described as looking somewhat ordinary when he is standing still. Ancient sources note that he was compact rather than tall, that his greatness became apparent not in his appearance, but in his words, in his voice, in the quality of his thinking. When he spoke, people stopped what they were doing and listened, not because he was shouting, but because whatever he said contained something that demanded attention. This is, when you think about it, a very unusual quality to celebrate in an ancient epic. The world of Bronze Age heroes was largely a world that celebrated physical excellence. Strength, speed, beauty, skill in combat. These were the virtues that gods favored and poets celebrated. And yet here, at the very center of one of the two great foundational epics of Western literature, is a hero whose primary virtue is his mind. Odysseus is called by several epithets throughout the poems. Polytropos, as we have already encountered, the man of many ways, the much-traveled one. But also Polytlas, much enduring, the one who has suffered greatly and continued anyway. And Polymetes, of many counsels, the man of many strategies, the one whose mind contains more possibilities than other men's minds. He is a king, but not a powerful one by the standards of the heroic age. Ithaca is a small island, not wealthy, not strategically significant. He has a modest fleet and a loyal household. What he has, above all else, is a wife and a son and a home that he loves with a quiet, persistent intensity that the poem returns to again and again, not as sentimentality, but as the engine of the entire narrative. His desire to return is not weakness. It is his most fundamental characteristic. This is worth pausing on, because it distinguishes Odysseus from almost every other hero in the Greek tradition. Achilles is driven by glory, by the desire to be remembered, by the hunger for a heroic death that will outlast time. Ajax is driven by pride and the obligations of warfare. Agamemnon is driven by power and the need to command. But Odysseus wants to go home. That is it. That is the entirety of his motivation. And in a tradition that celebrated the grandeur of heroic ambition, that quiet domestic longing is almost subversive. What makes it profound is that the poem takes that longing seriously. It does not treat the desire for home as a small thing or a lesser ambition than the desire for glory. It treats it as the most human desire of all. And it tests that desire against every conceivable temptation: comfort, pleasure, immortality, power, ease. And shows, slowly and carefully, that Odysseus chooses home every time, even when home is a difficult choice, even when home means hardship and danger, rather than the serene island paradise that other options might offer. There is also a darker side to Odysseus that the poem does not shy away from. He can be ruthless. He lies, sometimes when it is necessary, sometimes when it is convenient, and the poem occasionally makes it difficult to tell which is which. He makes mistakes, some of them catastrophic, costing him men and time and the goodwill of gods. He is not perfect. He is not meant to be. The poem is far too intelligent to offer a flawless hero. What Odysseus is, consistently and unmistakably, is fully human. More fully human, in many ways, than any other figure in ancient epic poetry. His fear is real. His grief is real. His joy, when it comes, is real. And his flaws, his pride, his occasional cruelty, his tendency to trust his own intelligence a fraction too much, are presented not to diminish him, but to complete him. This is probably why his story has lasted while so many others have faded. We recognize him, not as a type, but as a specific person. Someone who has been damaged by the world and is trying, with everything he has, to find his way back to the thing he loves. Now we need to understand what sent him away in the first place. Chapter 4. The war that started everything. The Odyssey does not begin with the Trojan War. It begins 10 years after it ended. But the war is present on every page, the way a wound is present in a body, even after it has technically healed. In the walk, in the posture, in the careful way certain movements are avoided. To understand the Odyssey, you need to understand Troy. The story of the Trojan War, at least in its Homeric form, begins with a wedding. The goddess Thetis, a sea nymph, is marrying the mortal king Peleus. Almost all the gods are invited. The goddess of discord, Eris, is not. Offended, she arrives anyway and throws a golden apple into the crowd with the inscription, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses claim it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus, wisely refusing to judge a contest between them himself, delegates the decision to a young man named Paris, a prince of Troy. Each goddess offers Paris a bribe. Hera offers power. Athena offers wisdom and skill in war. Aphrodite offers the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chooses Aphrodite's gift. And the most beautiful woman in the world is Helen, who is already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. What happens next depends on which version of the myth you follow. In most versions, Paris visits Menelaus, is treated as an honored guest, and then, when Menelaus is called away, leaves with Helen. Whether she goes willingly or unwillingly is a question the ancient sources never quite agree on, and the ambiguity may be intentional. Homer himself treats it with characteristic restraint, allowing the audience to draw their own conclusions. But the result is clear. Menelaus returns to find his wife gone. He calls on every king in Greece to honor the oath they had all sworn, the oath of Tyndareus, which bound every suitor of Helen to defend whichever man she chose as her husband. And so the Greek world mobilizes for war. This is where Odysseus enters the story, and his entrance is already complicated. According to traditions preserved in various ancient sources, Odysseus tried to avoid going to Troy. He pretended to be mad, plowing his fields and sowing them with salt. But Palamedes, sent by the Greeks to recruit him, saw through the deception. By placing Odysseus's infant son Telemachus in the path of the plow, forcing Odysseus to swerve and reveal his sanity. Whether or not this story is true in any historical sense, what it tells us about Odysseus as a character is significant. He did not want glory. He did not want war. He wanted to stay home with his wife and his son. He was taken from that life not by ambition, but by obligation, by the inescapable weight of an oath and the social contract of the heroic world. And then he was away for 20 years. 10 years of war. 10 years of wandering. By the time he finally returned, Telemachus had grown up without a father. Penelope had aged in a state of suspended grief. An entire generation had been shaped by his absence. The war itself was a long, grinding, brutal thing. Homer's Iliad captures a portion of it, specifically a critical period in the 10th year, on the wrath of Achilles and its consequences. But the war's full arc, from departure to victory, encompasses thousands of deaths, shifting alliances, divine interventions, and moments of heroism and horror in roughly equal measure. It ended, in the traditional account, through Odysseus's intelligence. The wooden horse. A massive wooden horse, hollow, filled with Greek soldiers, including Odysseus himself, was built and left outside the gates of Troy while the Greek fleet pretended to sail away. The Trojans, debating what to do with it, eventually brought it inside their walls. And that night, while Troy celebrated what it believed was the end of the war, the Greeks climbed out and opened the gates. Troy fell in a single night. The city was sacked, burned, destroyed. The Trojan men were killed. The women were taken as prizes and slaves. The king, Priam, was murdered. The war was over. And then 10,000 Greek soldiers tried to go home. Most of them made it eventually. Some made it quickly. Some, like Agamemnon, arrived home to find catastrophe waiting. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus within days of his return. Some were lost at sea in the great storm that scattered the Greek fleet after Troy's fall, when certain Greek commanders, flush with victory and careless about honoring the gods, committed acts of impiety that brought divine punishment down on the whole fleet. And Odysseus, clever, resourceful, much enduring Odysseus, began a journey home that would last another decade. Not because he was weak, not because he was unlucky in any simple sense, but because, on the very threshold of leaving Troy, he made a choice that brought upon him the implacable anger of a god. And that anger would follow him across every ocean, every island, every year of wandering, all the way to the edge of the world and back. Chapter 5. Why the Gods Were Angry. In the world of Homer, gods are not distant. They are not abstract forces observed from a respectful philosophical distance. They are present. They have opinions. They have preferences and grudges and favorites and enemies. And they intervene in human affairs with a directness that can feel startling to a modern reader, but which, in the context of the poem, is simply the nature of reality. Odysseus has, at the beginning of the Odyssey, a very specific divine problem. Poseidon hates him. Poseidon is the god of the sea. He is also, in Greek mythology, the god of earthquakes, the creator of horses, and a figure of enormous, volatile power. The kind of power that does not need to be precise to be devastating. The sea does not target you. It simply is what it is. But Poseidon makes it personal. The reason goes back to the Cyclops, which we will explore in detail later. For now, the essential fact is this. Odysseus blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, and Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon. When Polyphemus cried out in pain and rage, he prayed to his father to punish the man who had done this to him. And Poseidon listened. A god's anger in Homeric epic is not a metaphor. It is a physical force. It manifests in storms, in currents, in the behavior of the sea itself. Every time Odysseus is close to reaching home, every time the wind is favorable and the water is calm and the journey seems about to end, Poseidon finds him. Not always immediately, not always directly, but with a patience and persistence that suggests the sea's own quality of memory. The ocean does not forget. Against this, Odysseus has a protector, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and craft. She is drawn to him, the poem makes clear, precisely because he resembles her. He thinks before he acts. He plans. He adapts. He uses his mind as his primary tool in a world that usually values the sword. Athena recognizes in Odysseus a kind of mortal reflection of her own divine qualities, and her affection for him is genuine and consistent throughout the poem, even when she cannot intervene directly without crossing Poseidon or the will of Zeus. The divine politics of the Odyssey functions somewhat like a legal system in which powerful entities negotiate outcomes for mortals who often have no idea the negotiation is happening. Zeus presides, generally maintaining balance, occasionally intervening, but largely allowing the divine will of others to play out as long as certain fundamental limits are respected. Athena advocates for Odysseus. Poseidon opposes him. And Odysseus, down on the surface of the wine-dark sea, sails between these forces without fully understanding them, knowing only that the ocean is hostile and that somewhere, beyond the horizon, home is waiting. There is something quietly moving about this setup when you sit with it for a moment. Odysseus is not fighting ordinary enemies. He is fighting the sea itself, animated by divine grudge. The odds against him are not merely practical: bad weather, limited supplies, hostile populations. They are cosmic, and yet he persists. He endures. He finds ways through obstacles that should, by any reasonable calculation, be insurmountable. This is what polithlas means: much enduring. Not passive endurance, not simply absorbing punishment and hoping it stops. Active endurance, the kind that keeps finding the next foothold, the next strategy, the next way forward. The kind that does not confuse surviving with winning, but understands that sometimes surviving long enough is what winning looks like. The gods of the Odyssey are also, in a way that the poem handles with considerable subtlety, representations of the forces that any human life encounters. Poseidon is not only the literal sea, he is everything in life that is simply, impersonally against you. The circumstances of bad luck, the systems that seem designed to prevent your progress. The forces that do not hate you personally, but whose indifference is itself a kind of opposition. Athena is not only the literal goddess of wisdom. She is the quality in ourselves that thinks clearly under pressure, that plans when panic would be easier, that finds the pattern in apparent chaos. This is part of why the Odyssey translates so effortlessly into every era. Its surface is mythology, but its structure is a map of human experience. The gods set the terms. Odysseus has to live them. And the terms, as it turns out, are extremely demanding. At the opening of the poem, Odysseus has been absent from Ithaca for 20 years. He is currently stranded on a small island called Ogygia, in the middle of the ocean, kept there by the nymph Calypso, who loves him and will not let him go. His ships are all gone. His men are all dead. He is alone in a way that has no easy remedy. In Ithaca, his palace is overrun with suitors, men who have gathered from the surrounding islands and the mainland, ostensibly competing to marry Penelope, whom they assume is a widow, and by marrying her to claim Ithaca and its kingdom. They eat Odysseus's food. They drink his wine. They behave with a casual contempt for the household that they are technically courting. And Penelope and her son Telemachus, who is now almost 20 years old and has never met his father, are trapped. The gods convene. Athena makes her case. Zeus agrees that Odysseus has suffered enough. A divine decree is issued. The journey home can resume. The story begins. This is where the poem opens. Not at the beginning of the journey, not at Troy. Right here, at this moment of decision, when the gods decide to let the story move again after years of stasis. The Odyssey begins in media res, in the middle of things, a technique that Homer uses so effectively that it was still being used as a model by writers of the 20th century. We begin with a man who is not there, with a house that is occupied by strangers, with a son who is becoming a man in the absence of his father, with a wife who is running out of time, with a world waiting, not quite patiently, for something to change. And then it does. The sea opens up. The wind shifts. A raft is built on a divine nymph's island at the edge of the world. And Odysseus, battered, gray with salt, older than when he left, but still himself, still thinking, still planning, still wanting the same thing he has always wanted, sets out again for home. What happens next is the reason this story is still being told. The world has been set. The man has been introduced. The war that shattered the ancient world and scattered its survivors has been told. The gods have chosen sides. And on a small island at the edge of the known ocean, Odysseus is about to begin the last leg of a journey that has already taken everything from him, except the desire to finish it. The sea at night is not the same sea as the sea in daylight. Anyone who has spent time on open water but after dark knows this instinctively. During the day, the ocean is a surface, measurable, navigable, comprehensible in its general dimensions. At night, it becomes something else. The horizon disappears. The depth beneath you becomes unimaginable. The stars, which are the only fixed points of reference, feel simultaneously close and impossibly far. And the sounds of open water in darkness, are unlike anything on land. This is the world Odysseus inhabits for 10 years. Not the heroic, sunlit world of battle and glory that the Iliad celebrates, but the nighttime world of open water, of uncertainty, of islands appearing and disappearing, of winds that change without warning, of creatures and places that exist just beyond the edge of what any sailor from home would recognize. The journey in the Odyssey is not a single coherent voyage from point A to point B. It is a series of encounters, each one distinct, each one testing a different quality in the hero, each one costing something: men, ships, the goodwill of gods, the last fragments of a fleet that set out from Troy with 12 ships and arrives in Ithaca with none. Let's follow it. From the first landfall after Troy, through every island and catastrophe and strange encounter, all the way to the moment Odysseus finally steps onto the shore of home. Chapter 6. The Cyclones and the Lotus Eaters. The journey begins badly. This is, in retrospect, something of a pattern with Odysseus. Things begin badly, improve slightly through intelligence and effort, then collapse again through some combination of bad luck, divine opposition, and occasionally his own men's inability to follow instructions. But the very first failure is almost entirely the crew's fault, and it is worth understanding because it establishes the rhythm of what is to come. After leaving Troy, the fleet makes its first landfall at Ismarus, the city of the Cyclones, a Thracian people on the coast of what is now northeastern Greece. Odysseus sacks the city. This is warfare, and in the moral framework of the poem, not necessarily unjust, takes plunder, and then, critically, urges his men to leave immediately. He knows that the Cicones will have allies nearby. He knows that staying is dangerous. He tells them this. His men do not listen. They stay on the beach, feasting and drinking. By morning, the Cicones have called in their neighbors, and the Greeks are outnumbered. They fight their way back to the ships, but not before losing 6 men from each vessel, 72 men dead, and the fleet has barely left the coast of Europe. This detail matters because it establishes something important about the nature of the journey that is beginning. Odysseus is not all-powerful. He cannot control everything. He cannot make his men do what he tells them, always, in every situation. And the gap between his judgment and his men's behavior will be responsible, in various ways, for nearly every disaster that follows. From the Cicones, the fleet is caught in a brutal storm, a sign of divine displeasure, the poem suggests, and driven far off course. They eventually make landfall in the country of the Lotus Eaters. The Lotus Eaters are not violent. They are not threatening. They do not attack the Greeks or try to prevent them from leaving. They simply offer hospitality, and the hospitality they offer is the fruit of the lotus plant, which induces in whoever eats it a state of profound, peaceful forgetfulness. Several of Odysseus's men eat the lotus, and immediately, gently, they lose all desire to go home. Not in a dramatic way. There is no rage, no tears, no dramatic renunciation of their previous lives. They simply forget. They forget Ithaca. They forget their wives and children. They forget that they were on a journey at all. They sit contentedly in the country of the Lotus Eaters, feeling, one imagines, perfectly fine. Odysseus has to drag them back to the ships by force, weeping and struggling, and then restrain them under the rowing benches until they are far enough out to sea that the effect begins to wear off. This is one of those episodes that seems, on first reading, like a colorful adventure story, exotic fruit, mysterious people, a strange pharmacological effect. But it is also something more precise than that. The Lotus Eaters represent one of the Odyssey's central themes in its most distilled form: the temptation of forgetting, of simply stopping, of releasing the effort and the pain of the journey and accepting a comfortable, purposeless stasis. Every long journey offers some version of this temptation. Not always as lotus fruit, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as ease, sometimes as the gradual erosion of urgency, the slow fading of the original desire that set you moving. The men who eat the lotus do not choose to forget their homes. The forgetting happens to them. And that is precisely what makes it dangerous. Not that it is seductive in an obvious way, but that it arrives quietly and removes the very desire to resist it. Odysseus does not eat the lotus. He never does. This is not because he is immune to temptation. The poem will show clearly that he is not. It is because his desire for home is stronger than any single encounter, any single offer of ease or oblivion can overcome. He remembers, always. Even when remembering is painful. Even when forgetting would be, in the short term, much more comfortable. He drags his men back to sea. The journey continues. Chapter 7. The Cyclops. Of all the episodes in the Odyssey, the encounter with Polyphemus the Cyclops is the most famous, the most analyzed, and in many ways the most consequential. It is the moment that defines the middle portion of the journey, because it is the moment that earns Odysseus the hatred of Poseidon, a hatred that will follow him for years. It is also, in purely narrative terms, one of the most brilliantly constructed sequences in ancient literature. Odysseus and 12 of his men go ashore on a large island, which turns out to be the home of the Cyclopes, a race of enormous, one-eyed creatures who live as shepherds, without law, without community, without the social obligations that bind ordinary people to one another. The Cyclopes are, in the moral framework of the poem, the opposite of civilization. They do not farm. They do not hold assemblies. They do not practice hospitality, the sacred Greek obligation to welcome strangers and travelers, which was called xenia, and which was considered so fundamental that its violation was a direct offense against Zeus. Polyphemus, the largest Cyclops, is the son of Poseidon. He lives in a cave full of sheep and goats, cheeses and milk pails, a life of solitary pastoral simplicity. When Odysseus and his men enter the cave to shelter there, against the advice of the men who want to take what they can and leave, they are at first unseen. Then Polyphemus returns, closes the cave with an enormous boulder, and eventually notices them. He asks who they are. Odysseus, already thinking ahead, gives a deliberately vague answer about his men and mentions that they are under the protection of Zeus, invoking the god of hospitality. Polyphemus's response is immediate and chilling. He says, essentially, that the Cyclopes do not care about Zeus because they are stronger than the gods, and that he will do as he likes. He then picks up 2 of Odysseus's men, dashes their heads against the floor of the cave, and eats them. For breakfast, the next morning, he eats 2 more. Then he rolls the boulder back across the cave entrance, leaves for the day with his flocks, and Odysseus and the surviving men are left in the dark with the remains of their companions and the need to think very, very quickly. Odysseus cannot simply kill the Cyclops. This is the key insight of the episode. If he kills Polyphemus while the boulder is in place, they will never be able to move it themselves and will die in the cave. The monster, paradoxically, is also the only way out. So Odysseus needs to incapacitate him, not kill him, and do it in a way that allows for escape. He finds a massive wooden stake in the cave. He sharpens one end to a point and hardens it in the embers of the fire. And then he waits. When Polyphemus returns and eats 2 more men, Odysseus offers him wine, strong, undiluted wine that he had brought from the ship, a gift from a priest of Apollo, of unusual potency. Polyphemus drinks it. He is delighted. He asks Odysseus his name, promising him a gift in return. And Odysseus says, "My name is Nobody." Polyphemus laughs. He says that Nobody's gift will be that he is eaten last. Then he falls asleep, drunk, and Odysseus drives the sharpened stake into the fire until it glows, and then drives it into the Cyclops' single eye. Polyphemus screams. The other Cyclopes, sleeping in caves nearby, hear him and call out, "Who is hurting you? Is anyone attacking you?" And Polyphemus screams back, "Nobody! Nobody is killing me!" And the other Cyclopes, hearing this, decide there is nothing wrong and go back to sleep. It is, even now, a scene of startling comedic genius. The trick of the name, Nobody, is so simple that it seems almost too obvious. But its execution, and the moment when it pays off, works with the precision of a perfectly timed joke that is also, simultaneously, a matter of life and death. In the morning, blinded and in agony, Polyphemus rolls back the boulder to let his sheep out to graze, feeling along their backs as they pass to make sure no man rides out with them. Odysseus and his men escape by clinging beneath the bellies of the largest rams, hidden from his searching hands. They reach the ships. They push off. And then Odysseus does something that costs him everything. He cannot resist. As the ships row away, he calls back to the shore. He mocks Polyphemus. He tells him that his blindness is justice for eating the men. And then, despite his men begging him to stop, reaching for his arms, imploring him in urgent whispers to be quiet, he gives his real name. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, of Ithaca. He says it loudly enough to be heard. And Polyphemus, who has already prayed to his father Poseidon to curse this man, now has the name he needs to complete the curse. He hurls a chunk of cliff into the sea, aimed at the voice, and the wave it creates nearly drives the ships back onto shore. The ships pull away, but the damage is done. Poseidon has a name now, and Poseidon does not forget names. Why does Odysseus do it? Scholars and readers have been asking this for 3,000 years. The most honest answer is probably the most human one, because he is proud, and the pride wins briefly over the intelligence. Because he has endured the cave and the darkness and the death of his men, and he needs Polyphemus to know who defeated him. Because the cleverness that saved them required him to deny his own name, and something in him cannot bear to leave that denial in place permanently. It is a very human failure, not heroic in any grand sense, but recognizable. The impulse to claim credit, even at great cost. The inability to let a victory remain anonymous. And it costs him 10 years. Chapter 8. Aeolus and the Winds. The fleet sails on to the floating island of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, a figure who exists somewhere between mortal and divine, a man so favored by the gods that he has been given dominion over the winds themselves, which he keeps in a great bag of ox leather. Aeolus is hospitable. He welcomes Odysseus and his men, listens to the story of Troy with evident pleasure, and after a month of generous feasting, sends them on their way with an extraordinary gift. He gathers all the winds that might blow the fleet off course, every dangerous wind of the compass, and seals them inside the bag, leaving only the gentle west wind free to push the ships toward Ithaca. For 9 days and 9 nights, Odysseus himself holds the bag. He does not sleep. He does not let it out of his hands. For 9 days, Ithaca gets closer and closer until, on the 10th day, the men can see smoke rising from the hearth fires of home. And then Odysseus falls asleep. He has not slept in 9 days. His body simply fails him at the worst possible moment. His men, watching him sleep, begin to talk. They have been watching Odysseus hold this sealed bag for 9 days, and they have convinced themselves that it must contain treasure, gold and silver gifts from Aeolus, being kept from them by their captain. The story they tell each other has the particular vividness of a grievance held too long in silence. He gets everything. He keeps the best of it. And what do we get? They open the bag. Every wind that Aeolus had sealed inside comes rushing out at once. The ships are caught in a screaming gale and blown far back out to sea. When Odysseus wakes to find the coast of Ithaca gone and replaced by open ocean and raging storm, The grief and helplessness of that moment, so close and now so far, must be almost unbearable. The fleet returns to Aeolus, who refuses to help them a second time. He says, reasonably, that a man so obviously hated by the gods is not someone he is willing to assist further. He sends them away. There is a pattern forming in the Odyssey, and this episode makes it unmistakable. Odysseus's greatest enemy is not any external force, not even Poseidon, not entirely. It is the gap between his own judgment and the behavior of the people around him. His men, acting from their own fears and jealousies and failures of trust, undo what his intelligence has achieved. Again and again, at precisely the most critical moments, they make the wrong choice. And Odysseus, who cannot be everywhere, who must occasionally sleep, pays the price. This is not a cynical observation. It is a deeply realistic one. Leadership, the poem suggests, is not simply a matter of having the right plan. It is a matter of maintaining trust. And trust is fragile. And exhaustion is real. And even the best plan fails if the people executing it do not understand it or do not believe in it. Odysseus's greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability are the same thing. He is too far ahead of the people around him, and the distance between his thinking and theirs is the space through which catastrophe keeps entering. Chapter 9. The Laestrygonians and Circe. The fleet makes landfall next in the country of the Laestrygonians, another race of giants, but not the lumbering, slow, solitary kind. The Laestrygonians are organized. They have a city, a queen, a king named Antiphates. And when Odysseus's scouts enter that city and are brought before the queen immediately calls for her husband, who grabs one of the scouts and eats him before the others can react. What follows is the worst disaster of the entire voyage. Odysseus's ship, anchored in the outer harbor, survives because he is cautious by instinct. He had moored his own vessel outside the main anchorage while the rest of the fleet went inside the bay. The Laestrygonians swarm the cliffs above the harbor and begin hurling boulders down onto the ships trapped below. The ships are smashed. The men in the water are speared like fish. The entire fleet is destroyed except for Odysseus's own ship. He cuts the anchor rope and rows out of the harbor at maximum speed while his men, the survivors, weep on their oars. 11 ships and their crews gone in a single afternoon. 1 ship remains, 1 crew. And even this reduced, shattered remnant of the expedition that set out from Troy must keep moving, because the alternative is to stop, and stopping means dying. They come next to the island of Aeaea, home of the goddess Circe, daughter of Helios the sun god, niece of the witch Medea, herself a figure of formidable magical power. Circe is perhaps the most complex of the supernatural figures Odysseus encounters, and her episode in the Odyssey is one of its most carefully observed. A scouting party goes inland to explore the island. They find a beautiful house in the forest, surrounded by wild animals, wolves and lions who approach them not with aggression, but with gentle, almost dog-like friendliness. Inside the house, a goddess sings as she weaves. Circe welcomes them, offers them food and drink. The food and drink are drugged, and Circe touches them with her wand, and they become pigs, or rather, They are pigs now on the outside. But inside, they remain entirely themselves, which Homer specifies, and which is, in its own quiet way, the most disturbing detail of the episode. They know what has happened to them. They are aware of themselves, looking out through the eyes of pigs. One man, Eurylochus, suspicious of the too perfect welcome, had stayed outside. He runs back to the ship and tells Odysseus what has happened. Odysseus goes alone to rescue his men. On the way through the forest, he encounters the god Hermes, who gives him a plant called moly, a divine antidote to Circe's magic, and specific instructions on how to handle the encounter. When Circe tries to drug him, he is immune. When she tries to touch him with her wand, he draws his sword and threatens her. Circe, recognizing that this man can only be Odysseus, for the god Hermes has told her to expect him, asks him to sleep with her. And in one of the poem's stranger turns, Odysseus does, but only after making her swear a divine oath not to harm him further, and after she agrees to restore his men. Odysseus and his crew stay on Circe's island for a year. A year. The poem mentions this with a kind of disarming casualness, as if a year of comfortable living with a goddess on a magical island is simply a thing that happens in the course of a difficult journey home. Circe is generous, knowledgeable, and eventually genuinely helpful. It is she who tells Odysseus that he must visit the underworld before he can continue home, that the blind prophet Tiresias holds the information he needs. She provides detailed directions and advice, and when the crew finally decides to leave, she is sad to see them go, but lets them go without resistance. This is worth noting, because it creates a subtle contrast with Calypso, the nymph who will hold Odysseus captive later, and who will not release him without divine intervention. Circe, for all her initial hostility, is ultimately moved by something in Odysseus that leads her to help him, rather than hold him. Whether that something is love, respect, or a recognition of the sheer weight of his desire for home is left, characteristically, for the audience to decide. The crew buries one of their number, a young man named Elpenor, who, in the confusion of departure, fell from the roof of Circe's house and died. He will appear again later, in circumstances that make this moment of careless death quietly heartbreaking in retrospect. And then, following Circe's instructions, they sail toward the place where the world ends and the dead are waiting. Chapter 10. The Land of the Dead. No episode in the Odyssey is more remarkable than the descent to the underworld, the Nequia, which occupies the 11th book of the poem. It is a scene that shaped Western literature in ways that are almost impossible to fully trace. Virgil echoed it in the Aeneid. Dante echoed it in the Inferno. And its influence extends through the centuries in forms too numerous to count. Odysseus does not actually descend into the earth. The geography is characteristically Homeric in its poetic vagueness. He sails to the edge of the world, to a place where the river of ocean flows around the boundaries of existence. And there he performs a ritual that allows the dead to speak with him. He digs a trench, fills it with the blood of sacrificed animals, and the shades of the dead come crowding to drink. For blood, in Homeric belief, is what temporarily restores to the dead enough of their living presence to speak and be understood. The first shade to appear is Elpenor, the young man who fell from Circe's roof. He has not yet been buried. His body still lies on the island, and he begs Odysseus to return and give him proper burial rites. It is a quiet, heartbreaking moment, the way grief in Homer often is, not announced dramatically, but arriving in the middle of other concerns, demanding attention precisely because it is inconvenient. Then Tiresias comes, the blind prophet who in life knew more than most living men, and in death retains that knowledge. He drinks from the trench and speaks plainly to Odysseus, which is itself remarkable. Most of the dead speak with some diminishment of their living personality, filtered through the strange half-existence of the underworld. Tiresias speaks with authority. He tells Odysseus what he needs to know. He will reach home, but not easily. He must avoid harming the cattle of Helios, the sun god, on the island of Thrinacia. His crew will die if they touch those cattle. He himself will survive if he keeps his wits about him. The suitors must be dealt with. And after all of this is done, Odysseus must make one more journey inland, away from the sea, to a place so remote from the ocean that the people there mistake an oar for a winnowing fan. And there he must plant the oar and make a sacrifice to Poseidon. And only then will the sea god finally release his grudge. After Tiresias, other shades come. Odysseus's mother, Anticleia, who died of grief during his long absence. This he did not know. He tries 3 times to embrace her, and 3 times she slips through his arms, because the dead cannot be held by the living. She tells him about Ithaca, about Penelope's faithfulness, about his father Laertes, who has retreated to the countryside in his grief and tends his orchard in lonely old age. The great heroes of the Trojan War appear. Agamemnon, who tells the story of his murder with a bitterness that has not softened in death, and warns Odysseus to be cautious when he reaches home, to not trust too openly. The lesson of Agamemnon's fate, repeated throughout the poem, is that homecoming is not inherently safe, that a house can be occupied by danger, that the hero who has survived every external threat can be destroyed by what waits at home. Achilles comes. And the conversation between Odysseus and Achilles is one of the most quietly devastating exchanges in the poem. Odysseus, trying to offer comfort, tells Achilles that here among the dead he is surely a great king. Achilles answers with characteristic directness. He would rather be the lowest farmhand among the living than a king over all the dead. All the glory that he chose, the immortal fame that he purchased with an early death, none of it, he says, matters against the simple fact of being alive. This is extraordinary. Achilles, whose entire story is built on the choice of glory over long life, expressing from the underworld a preference for the opposite. It is not presented as regret exactly, more as clarification, as if death has simplified the calculation in a way that living made complicated. And it serves, in the structure of the Odyssey, as a kind of argument for everything Odysseus is doing, for the choice of home and life and ordinary human time over heroic transcendence. Other figures pass through. Heracles, whose ghost haunts the underworld while his divine self feasts on Olympus, a detail that Homer offers without commentary, but which is somehow melancholy. Ajax, still furious about the judgment of Achilles' armor, who refuses to speak to Odysseus at all, turning away into the shadows with a silence that says everything. Odysseus, as the shades grow more numerous and more pressing, decides he has heard enough and retreats to the ship. He has learned what he needed to learn. The dead have confirmed the living's obligations. He sails back to Circe's island, buries Elpenor with proper ceremony, receives final advice from Circe for the journey ahead, and sets out again. What comes next is the most dangerous stretch of the voyage. Chapter 11. Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. Circe has prepared Odysseus for what lies ahead, and this preparation is itself significant. The heroes of the Iliad rarely receive advance warning of what they will face. They encounter the world and respond. Odysseus, by contrast, is repeatedly given information, advice, and instruction by Circe, by Tiresias, by Ino the sea nymph. And the question the poem asks is not whether he has the strength to endure what comes, but whether he has the wisdom to use the knowledge he has been given. The sirens come first. They are, in Homer's version, not the fish-tailed creatures of later tradition, but figures whose precise form is never described. What matters is their voices, and what their voices do, they sing from their island to every ship that passes, and every ship that turns toward the singing never leaves. The island is surrounded by the bones of sailors. Circe's advice is precise. Stop the ears of your crew with wax, and if you wish to hear the sirens yourself, have your men tie you to the mast and instruct them not to release you, no matter what you say or do. Odysseus follows the instructions exactly. He stops the crew's ears. He has them bind him to the mast. And as they row past the Sirens' island, he hears the singing. What the sirens sing has been interpreted many ways. In Homer, they offer knowledge, all that has happened on the earth, all that will happen. They are not simply beautiful noise, but something more specifically tempting. The promise of complete understanding, of knowing everything, of never being surprised by the world again. This is a seduction aimed very precisely at a man whose primary virtue is his intelligence. Odysseus strains against the ropes. He signals urgently with his eyebrows for the men to release him. The men, seeing the signal, as Circe predicted they would, tie the ropes tighter and row faster. They cannot hear the singing. They do not know what they are missing. Their ignorance is, in this moment, their protection. Odysseus hears the entire song. He is not released. They pass out of range. The singing fades, and the ship continues. There is something in this episode that rewards sitting with. Odysseus found a way to have the experience without being destroyed by it, to hear the sirens and survive. He did this not through heroic resistance alone, but through a kind of intelligent surrender, by binding himself in advance, by removing from his future self the power to make the wrong choice in the moment of temptation. He knew he could not trust himself in the moment, so he arranged, ahead of time, to be protected from his own impulse. This is not a common heroic strategy, but it is a deeply human one, and its elegance is part of what makes the Sirens episode so enduring. Immediately after the Sirens comes the strait between Scylla and Charybdis. There is no good path through. Circe has made this clear. On one side is Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that 3 times a day sucks the water down to the bare seabed, and 3 times a day expels it again in a catastrophic surge. A ship caught in Charybdis, when it drains, is simply gone. On the other side is Scylla, a monster with 12 legs and 6 heads, each head on a long neck, each neck capable of reaching down to a passing ship and seizing a sailor. She eats 6 at a time. Circe's advice, again, is precise and painful. Hug the side of Scylla. Accept the loss of 6 men rather than risk the whirlpool that will take all of them. Do not try to fight Scylla. Fighting her is pointless. She cannot be killed. And trying to fight her wastes the time needed to row past. Just row. Lose 6. And do not stop. Odysseus follows the instruction. He does not tell his men about Scylla, knowing that if he does, they will stop rowing in terror. He arms himself and stands at the prow, watching the cliff face on the Scylla side with his sword drawn, as if this might somehow help. It does not help. Scylla takes 6 men. They cry out his name as they are lifted. They reach toward him. And Odysseus, who has faced every horror of this journey, says that of everything he has witnessed in all his years at sea and at war, watching those 6 men taken is the worst thing he has ever seen. The ship gets through. 6 men are gone. The rest continue. This is the Odyssey at its most honest and most unsparing. There is no way through that costs nothing. The choice between Scylla and Charybdis is not a choice between a good option and a bad one. It is a choice between 2 bad options, and the wisdom is in choosing the one that preserves the most. Odysseus cannot save everyone. He can save most. And the grief of that calculation, of knowing you chose correctly and still losing people, is presented by the poem without any softening. He does not pretend it was easy. He does not pretend it was worth it. He simply carries it and keeps rowing. Chapter 12. The Cattle of the Sun and the Final Storm. They reach the island of Thrinacia. This is the island Tiresias warned them about. The cattle of Helios graze here, magnificent creatures, golden-horned, the property of the sun god himself, immortal and untouchable. Tiresias was explicit. Do not harm the cattle. Circe was explicit. Do not harm the cattle. The consequences of harming them were made perfectly clear. Odysseus knows all of this. He stands before his exhausted, grieving crew and tells them they must sail past Thrinacia without stopping. They are tired. They are devastated by the passage through the strait. They want to rest. And the island is right there. Eurylochus, the same man who had the good sense to stay outside Circe's house, speaks for the crew. He argues, not entirely unreasonably, that the men need sleep, need food, need rest, that they can land on Thrinacia, camp on the beach, sleep, and depart in the morning without touching the cattle. Odysseus yields. Under protest, under the condition of sworn oaths from the entire crew that they will not touch the cattle, he lets them land. They are trapped on the island for a month by contrary winds. Eurylochus suspects these winds are divine, sent to keep them there until they do the thing they have sworn not to do. And he may well be right. Their provisions run out. They are fishing and hunting birds, whatever they can find. And the cattle, gleaming in the sunlight, are everywhere. Odysseus, at some point during this month, goes inland to pray and falls asleep. While he sleeps, Eurylochus makes his argument to the crew. Death by starvation on this island, he says, or death at sea in a storm if they have offended the gods. But which death is more immediate? The cattle are right here. They can sacrifice them properly, with proper ritual observances, and perhaps Helios will understand. And perhaps, when they get home, they can build a great temple to Helios as atonement. The men kill the cattle. When Odysseus wakes and smells the roasting meat, the despair he feels is described in terms that leave no ambiguity. He knows, immediately, that everything is over. Helios complains to Zeus. Zeus promises retribution. The crew feasts, prepares the ship, departs, and within days, after finally clearing the island, are caught in a catastrophic storm sent by Zeus. The ship is struck by lightning and destroyed. The mast falls. The keel snaps. Everyone drowns, except Odysseus. He clings to the broken keel and the mast, ties them together with a piece of the backstay, and drifts. The current carries him back toward Charybdis, of all places, the whirlpool from which there is no escape for a ship. His makeshift raft is sucked down. At the last possible moment, as the fig tree above the whirlpool passes within reach, he grabs a branch and holds on, suspended above the churning water, waiting for the whirlpool to expel what it has taken. He waits a long time, long enough for a man to go for his evening meal and return, the poem says. And then the water surges back, and his raft surfaces, and he drops onto it and paddles away. He is alone now. Every ship is gone. Every man is dead. The fleet that left Troy 10 years ago, that fought its way through giants and monsters and divine storms, has been reduced to one exhausted man on a makeshift raft in the middle of the ocean. He drifts for 9 days. On the 10th, he washes up on a shore. Chapter 13. Calypso's Island. The shore belongs to Calypso. She is a nymph, the daughter of the Titan Atlas, and she lives on an island called Ogygia that is described with an almost excessive beauty, flowering meadows, forests of alder and cypress and fragrant cedar, 4 springs running with clear water, birds nesting everywhere, grapevines heavy with fruit. Even the gods who visit Ogygia, the poem says, stand and admire it. Calypso finds Odysseus on the beach, half dead, alone, the single survivor of everything that happened. She takes him in. She cares for him. And she falls in love with him, or something that the poem treats as functionally equivalent to love. And she keeps him. Not with chains, not with threats, not, after the first period, with any kind of force. She keeps him with the island itself, which has no means of departure, no ship, no timber suitable for building one, and with a more extraordinary offer. She offers him immortality. If he stays with her on Ogygia, she will make him immortal and forever young. He will never age. He will never die. He will live in this beautiful place with a beautiful goddess for the rest of time. This is not an obviously bad offer. By most calculations, it is a staggering offer. Immortality and ease versus the danger and uncertainty of an ocean voyage home to a mortal life that will eventually end. Every rational calculation says, stay. And yet every morning, Odysseus walks to the shore and sits facing west, toward home, and weeps. He stays on Ogygia for 7 years. Homer does not linger over those 7 years, which is itself a kind of characterization. They are not nothing. Calypso's company is real. The comfort of the island is real. But they are not the story. The story is the direction he faces every morning, and what it costs him to face it when there is nothing he can do. Then the gods convene. Athena makes her case. Zeus agrees. Hermes is sent to Ogygia with a divine instruction for Calypso. Release him. Calypso is not happy. She says, with some justice, that the gods are always interfering when a goddess loves a mortal, while male gods take mortal lovers all the time without complaint. She is not wrong, but she obeys. She finds Odysseus on the beach, facing west, weeping as usual. She tells him he can go. She offers to help him build a raft. And in a remarkable exchange, she asks him directly, "Do you really want to go home?" She is right there. She loves him. Home means Penelope, who is mortal, who is aging, who cannot compete with a goddess's beauty or offer him what Calypso can offer. Odysseus is completely honest. He says, "Penelope cannot compare to you in beauty or in lifespan. I know this. But I want to go home. That's the whole truth of it. I want to go home." It is one of the most quietly powerful declarations in the entire poem. No heroic boast, no grand philosophical argument, just a simple, direct statement of what he wants, placed against everything that has been offered to him, and the fact that none of it changes the essential direction of his longing. Calypso helps him build the raft. She gives him food and provisions. She gives him a fair wind. And Odysseus, on a raft he built himself on an immortal's island at the edge of the world, sails toward home. Poseidon, returning from a journey among the Ethiopians, sees him. One last storm is sent. The raft is smashed. Odysseus is thrown into the sea. He survives, helped by a divine scarf from the sea nymph Ino, which keeps him afloat. He swims for 2 days and 2 nights. And on the 3rd morning, half dead again, he washes up on the shore of a country called Scheria, home of a people called the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians are the bridge between the world of myth and the world of home. They are a semi-divine people, beloved of the gods, skilled sailors who can navigate any sea without instruments or charts. And they will, in the end, be the ones who carry Odysseus home, sleeping, wrapped in Phaeacian blankets, in a Phaeacian ship that crosses the water in a single night with supernatural speed. But before that happens, he has to persuade them to help him. He has to tell his story. He has to find the words to explain where he has been and what he has lost and why getting home matters after everything that has happened. He washes up on a beach in Scheria, finds a copse of olive trees, buries himself under a pile of leaves for warmth, and sleeps the sleep of the completely exhausted. Tomorrow, a princess named Nausicaa will come to the beach to do laundry, and the last leg of the journey will begin. The wandering is almost over. Almost. The voyage has been told in full. From the first landfall after Troy, through the Lotus Eater's quiet oblivion, the Cyclops' cave and the name that cost 10 years, the winds of Aeolus undone by jealousy, the giants and the sorceress, and the land of the dead, the Sirens, and the strait, where 6 men were taken and nothing could be done about it, the cattle that should not have been touched, the storm that ended everything, 7 years on an immortal's island. And now a man made of salt and exhaustion lies under a pile of leaves on a beach, 1 night's sailing from home, with nothing left but the desire that has kept him alive through all of it. While Odysseus was building his raft on Calypso's island, while he was navigating the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, while he was sitting on beaches facing west and weeping for a home he could not reach, Ithaca was not frozen in time waiting for him. Ithaca was changing, slowly and then faster, and then in ways that had become very difficult to reverse. This is one of the things the Odyssey understands about long absence that most stories about journeys do not bother to explore. The person who leaves is the one having the adventures. The people who stay are having their own ordeal, quieter, and in some ways more grueling, because it consists not of monsters and storms, but of time. Just time, passing, with no resolution, no news, no way of knowing whether to mourn or to hope. Penelope has been doing this for 20 years. The Odyssey tells 2 stories simultaneously. The one we followed in Part 2, the wanderer's journey through the mythological world. And this one, the story of what happens to a household, a kingdom, and a family when the person at the center of it simply does not come back. Homer moves between these 2 threads with a confidence that feels almost novelistic in its complexity, cutting between Odysseus's adventures and the situation in Ithaca with an instinct for dramatic contrast that still works on a reader the way it was always intended to. Before we can understand the climax of the poem, the return, the recognition, the violence of reclamation, we need to understand what Ithaca became in Odysseus's absence. We need to understand the suitors, and Penelope's war against them, and what Telemachus did when he finally decided he could not simply wait anymore. This is the half of the story that tends to get summarized in 2 sentences and then skipped over in favor of the monsters and the magic. That is a mistake, because the Ithaca story is, in some ways, the emotional core of the entire poem. Chapter 14. Penelope's War. The suitors arrived gradually. That is the first thing to understand about them. They did not appear all at once, like an invading army, with declared intentions and organized demands. They accumulated, over months, over years, the way a problem accumulates when no one is quite ready to address it directly. In the years immediately after Troy fell, it was still reasonable to assume Odysseus was simply delayed. Many Greeks had difficult homecomings. Storms, detours, the long logistics of post-war return. None of this was unusual. Penelope waited, and her waiting was not yet siege, merely patience. But as the years passed, the situation shifted. Ithaca had no king in any functional sense. Laertes, Odysseus's elderly father, had retreated from public life in his grief and was living quietly on his farm outside the city, tending his orchard, effectively absent from the governance of the island. Telemachus was a child, then an adolescent, without authority. And Penelope was a woman in a world where women's social and political power was real, but bounded specifically by the institution of marriage, which meant that her status was tied to her relationship to a husband who might or might not be alive. The suitors came from the surrounding islands and the mainland. They came from noble families, young men with ambitions and connections, who had calculated, not entirely irrationally, that Odysseus was probably dead, that Ithaca needed a king, that Penelope was still attractive and still controlled the household and whatever inheritance Odysseus left behind, and that marrying her was a reasonable path to acquiring all of it. There were, by the time the Odyssey opens, 108 of them. 108 young men, eating and drinking in Odysseus's great hall, day after day, consuming the estate's cattle and sheep and wine, holding essentially permanent parties in someone else's house, treating the household staff with casual contempt, competing with each other and arguing and making noise, and pressing Penelope with varying degrees of directness to choose one of them and get the matter settled. Penelope could not simply refuse forever. The social logic of the situation was against her. An unattached widow of uncertain status, with a son not yet old enough to formally assert his authority, in a world that required women to exist within male-defined social structures, she was in a genuinely precarious position. Outright refusal risked conflict, possibly violence. Passive acceptance meant the loss of everything Odysseus had left. So she did something else. She told the suitors she would choose among them when she had finished weaving a burial shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's father, a task that piety and social obligation required, and that the suitors could not reasonably object to without appearing disrespectful to the gods. She began weaving, and every night, secretly, by lamplight, she unraveled what she had woven during the day. She did this for 3 years. 3 years of weaving and unweaving, of maintaining the fiction of progress while making none, of buying time through a deception so simple and so quiet that it worked for 3 years before one of the household women, a disloyal servant, revealed it to the suitors. When the suitors discovered the trick, their patience, already thinning, became something harder. They demanded that the weaving be completed. They became more aggressive about their presence, more pointed in their expectations. The situation in the palace became, by the time the Odyssey opens, genuinely threatening. What Penelope did with the shroud is sometimes treated as clever strategy in the vein of Odysseus himself, and the parallel is clearly intentional, because the poem wants us to see them as matched intelligences, as two people who share a quality of mind that is precisely what holds their marriage together across 20 years of separation. But it is also something more than strategy. It is a form of faith maintained through action. The faith that he is still out there, that waiting is not foolishness, that the thread she keeps unpicking is connected somehow to the thread of his survival. She does not know this, of course. She has no reliable information about whether Odysseus is alive. Various travelers and wanderers appear at the palace over the years and tell her stories, some true, some invented, some optimistic fabrications designed to please a grieving wife and perhaps earn a meal. She listens to all of them. She weeps. She is not credulous, but she is also not ready to stop hoping. The suitors, as the Odyssey opens, are beginning to discuss a new approach. Telemachus is now nearly 20. If he asserts himself, if he gathers allies, if he develops into a real political and military force, he complicates their situation considerably. Several of the suitors, led by the two most dangerous and unpleasant among them, Antinous and Eurymachus, are discussing the possibility of simply killing him. This is no longer a romantic competition. This has become a political crisis with lethal edges. Penelope navigates it with a combination of genuine anguish and remarkable composure. The poem gives us access to her private moments, her weeping, her prayers to Artemis, her conversations with her maids, the dream she has of an eagle killing 20 geese, and the desperate uncertainty of what it means. She is not a passive figure. She is not simply waiting. She is managing an extraordinarily difficult situation with the tools available to her, which are limited, but which she uses with everything she has. And quietly, in the background, she has already decided something. She has designed the contest of the great bow, that will eventually resolve everything. Whether she has intuited something about the timing of her husband's return, whether she is simply at the end of her endurance, or whether it is something the gods have arranged through her without her knowledge, the poem leaves deliberately unclear. But the contest she announces, and the terms she sets, will be precisely the trap that springs on the suitors at exactly the right moment. She is, the poem makes clear, her husband's equal, not in the same ways, not with the same tools, not in the same world, but in the quality of intelligence and endurance that matters most. They are the same person. Chapter 15. Telemachus grows up. The Odyssey does not begin with Odysseus. It begins with Telemachus. The first 4 books of the poem, sometimes called the Telemachy, follow the young man who has grown up in a house full of his father's absence and other men's noise. He is, at the poem's opening, somewhere between adolescence and adulthood, not quite either, caught in a developmental suspension that the poem treats as related to his father's absence in ways that are both literal and symbolic. He cannot become the man he needs to be until he knows what happened to the man he came from. He is not weak, exactly. He has moments of real spirit, of assertion, of anger at the suitors that surfaces in sharp remarks and defiant postures. But he does not yet have the confidence that comes from having done things, from having tested himself against the world and found out what he is capable of. He has been shaped entirely by the negative space of his father's absence, by learning, since childhood, to be careful, to be quiet, to manage a situation he cannot control. Athena arrives at the palace in disguise. This is one of her characteristic moves throughout the poem, appearing in mortal form to nudge events in the direction she wants them to go. She finds Telemachus and essentially tells him what he needs to do. Go to the mainland. Visit Nestor at Pylos and Menelaus at Sparta. Ask about your father. Find out what happened. And by the act of going, become someone who has gone. The advice has a practical component, gathering information about Odysseus's fate, and a developmental one that the poem understands perfectly. Telemachus needs to leave home in order to be ready to return to it. He needs his own journey, and it is a brief one, in order to grow into the capacity to stand beside his father when his father finally returns. He assembles a crew in secret, slipping away from the palace before the suitors can stop him. And some of them try when they find out, organizing an ambush at sea that he escapes through Athena's guidance. At Pylos, he meets Nestor, old, garrulous, the great teller of stories, who remembers the fall of Troy and the difficult homecomings that followed. Nestor tells him what he knows, which is not much about Odysseus specifically, but which includes the story of Agamemnon's murder, a cautionary tale about what happens to houses in a king's absence, and sends him on to Sparta. At Sparta, Telemachus meets Menelaus and Helen. And this meeting is remarkable in the texture of it, the way Homer stages the reunion of the young son of Odysseus with the couple whose marriage started everything. Helen is there, beautiful and composed, hosting with elegance, still somehow at the center of the world. She recognizes Telemachus immediately by his resemblance to his father. She gives him a gift, a robe woven by her own hands for his future bride. Menelaus tells what he knows. He heard from the shape-shifting sea god Proteus, whom he wrestled into submission in the coast of Egypt, that Odysseus was alive, or was alive at some point not too long ago, stranded on an island, kept there by a nymph, weeping on the shore. This is, by the standards of what Telemachus has been living with, almost miraculous news. He has a father. His father is alive. His father is trying to come home. He returns to Ithaca with this knowledge, and with something else that the journey has given him, the beginning of himself. He has been in the world. He has been treated as Odysseus's son by men who knew Odysseus. He has heard stories of who his father was, and found in himself enough resemblance to be recognized. He is not yet the man he will need to be, but he is closer. He arrives back in Ithaca just as his father does, and they find each other, father and son meeting for the first time in living memory, in a swineherd's hut on the outskirts of the island, and the recognition scene between them is handled by Homer with a restraint that makes it more moving than any amount of dramatic elaboration could have achieved. But before we get there, we need to follow Odysseus from the beach in Scheria, through the Phaeacians, and across the last stretch of water that separates him from home. Chapter 16. The Return of the Stranger. Odysseus wakes on the beach in Scheria, to the sound of girls playing ball. Nausicaa, the daughter of the Phaeacian king Alcinous, has come to the beach with her maids to wash the household laundry. They wash the clothes, spread them in the sun, eat a picnic lunch, and begin playing ball. The ball goes into the water. They shout. The noise wakes Odysseus. He emerges from the olive thicket, naked, crusted with salt, hair matted, looking, as the poem freely admits, like something that has been through a great deal. The maids scatter. Nausicaa stays. And Odysseus, assessing the situation with that characteristic speed of calculation, gives a speech that is a small masterpiece of tact and perception. He does not touch her. He stands at a respectful distance. He compares her to a goddess, but does so in terms that acknowledge he cannot be certain she is not one. He tells her he is a shipwreck survivor who needs help. He asks for her assistance in the most non-threatening way available to a large, disheveled, salt-covered man who has materialized from the bushes. Nausicaa, who is brave and generous, and clearly a little charmed by this improbable stranger, gives him clothes and food and directions to her father's palace, and advises him on the best approach to take with her parents. The Phaeacians are extraordinary hosts. Their culture is built around the tradition of hospitality that Polyphemus violated so catastrophically. King Alcinous welcomes the stranger before he even knows who he is, which is the proper form of the custom. You welcome first. You ask questions later. There is feasting and entertainment. A blind bard named Demodocus, who sings the stories of the Trojan War. Twice, Demodocus sings about the fall of Troy, and twice, Odysseus weeps and hides his face in his cloak, and twice, Alcinous notices and stops the singing. The third time, Demodocus sings a story about Odysseus himself, about his cleverness, about the wooden horse, about the fall of Troy, and Odysseus weeps openly, and Alcinous stops everything and asks, gently but directly, "Who are you?" And Odysseus, in the company of these hospitable strangers who cannot harm him and who have already decided to help him regardless of his name, tells his story. The entirety of books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey, the Cyclops, Aeolus, the Lastrygonians, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of Helios, Calypso. All of it is Odysseus narrating his own journey to the Phaeacians in a single long-after-dinner account. This narrative structure is one of Homer's most elegant choices. By having Odysseus tell his own story, Homer gives the audience something they would not otherwise have: access to Odysseus's interpretation of events. Not just what happened, but how he experienced it, what he felt, what mattered to him, and what he chose to emphasize. It is, in some ways, the most intimate section of the poem, and the Phaeacians listening to it are stand-ins for Homer's audience, pulled into the story by the same quality of narration that Odysseus uses to pull them in. Alcinous, deeply moved, immediately organizes the return. A Phaeacian ship is prepared. Odysseus is loaded onto it, wrapped in blankets, already asleep before they leave the harbor. The Phaeacian ships are legendarily fast, and this one covers the distance in a single night. In the early morning, they arrive off the coast of Ithaca. They carry Odysseus ashore, still sleeping, lay him on the beach with his treasure piled beside him, and return to Scheria. Poseidon, furious at the Phaeacians for helping his enemy, turns their returning ship to stone just as it enters the harbor at Scheria, a punishment for a people who had nothing to do with the quarrel between a god and a man, but who helped the wrong person at the wrong time. The poem notes this without extended comment, but it lingers uneasily, the way a slightly unjust thing lingers. Odysseus wakes on the beach of Ithaca. He does not recognize it at first. Athena has wrapped the island in a mist, partly to protect him while he takes stock of his situation, partly because the gods have a tendency toward dramatic management of these things. He is confused, briefly heartbroken, convinced somehow that the Phaeacians have left him at the wrong place. Then Athena appears, still in disguise, as a young shepherd boy. She tells him where he is, and there is a quiet comedy in his response. He immediately invents a false story for this stranger, a whole fabricated identity. Before Athena drops her disguise and reveals herself, laughing at him affectionately, saying that he cannot help himself, he lies even when there is no need, and that this is precisely why she loves him. She tells him the situation in Ithaca. She lays out the reality of the suitors, and she and Odysseus, together, begin to plan. He disguises himself as an old beggar. Athena transforms his appearance, aging him, roughening his skin, dimming his eyes, wrapping him in rags. He needs to enter his own palace without being recognized, to observe the situation, to identify who among the household is still loyal and who has gone over to the suitors, to make contact with Telemachus, and to wait for exactly the right moment. The first person he seeks out is Eumaeus, his old swineherd. A loyal man, one of the figures the poem treats with real warmth, a slave by circumstance, but a person of complete integrity, who in Odysseus's absence has maintained his obligations to the household and his love for his absent master without any expectation of reward. Eumaeus does not recognize the beggar, but he treats him with exactly the hospitality that defines the good people of this poem, welcoming him, feeding him, giving him a bed, speaking of his lost master with a grief that is still raw after 20 years. Telemachus arrives. He has just returned from Sparta, and Odysseus contrives to be alone with him and reveals himself. The disguise drops. The divine intervention that Athena effects is sudden, and Telemachus stands looking at a man who is suddenly, unmistakably, his father. He does not quite believe it at first. He thinks it must be a god, and Odysseus has to reassure him. No, I am not a god. I am your father, and I have finally come home. What follows is one of those moments in the poem that Homer, with characteristic restraint, does not overwrite. The weeping is there. Both of them weep deeply, the way men weep in Homer, without embarrassment and without excessive elaboration. And then, because they are both their father's son and their father, they stop weeping and begin planning. This meeting, in the swineherd's hut, with Odysseus in disguise and Telemachus barely able to look at this man who is somehow his father, after 20 years of being only an absence and a story. This is one of the great recognition scenes in all of literature. And it works because Homer has built toward it carefully, through the entire first half of the poem, showing us the son growing up in one thread and the father surviving in another, until the two threads are ready to be tied together. They plan together. Telemachus will return to the palace. Odysseus, still in disguise, will follow. No one is to be told. The bow contest, which Penelope has announced, will be the moment. And when that moment comes, Telemachus will know it, and Odysseus will know it, and they will act together. First, though, Odysseus has to walk into his own palace as a stranger and see what 20 years have made of it. Chapter 17, Part 1. The Return of the Stranger in the Hall. The palace of Odysseus, seen through the eyes of a disguised beggar, is a study in contrasts. There is still something magnificent about it, the scale, the structure, the history embedded in its stones and timber. But the magnificence is overlaid with something wrong, something slightly off in the way that a great house slowly degrading under bad management feels different from a house that was simply built modestly. The suitors fill the great hall. They are loud, careless, proprietary, moving through the space as if they own it, which in a sense they have decided they do. They treat the servants roughly, demand constantly, and react to any check on their behavior with the particular unpleasantness of people who have been getting away with things for too long. Odysseus, as the beggar, moves through the hall begging from each of the suitors in turn. This is a social practice the poem treats seriously. The obligation to give to a beggar is part of the same system of hospitality that has protected Odysseus throughout his travels. The suitors, predictably, are mixed in their responses, ranging from dismissive to actively hostile. The most actively hostile is Antinous, who throws a footstool at the beggar. This act is noticed and condemned even by some of the other suitors, who have enough social awareness to know that hitting a beggar is the kind of thing the gods take notice of. Antinous does not care. Odysseus, absorbing the blow, says very little. He is watching, cataloging, making the calculations that will determine who survives what is coming. An old dog lies in the yard. His name is Argos. He was Odysseus's hunting dog, raised from a puppy, and he is ancient now, lying on a pile of dung, unable to move. When Odysseus approaches, Argos lifts his head and wags his tail. It is the only sign of recognition anyone gives Odysseus in the early days of his return. His own old dog, too far gone to do anything but acknowledge that his master has finally come back. Then Argos drops his head and dies. Homer spends perhaps 8 lines on Argos. 8 lines in a poem of 12,000. And yet, it is one of the most famous passages in ancient literature, because in those 8 lines, without melodrama or exaggeration, he captures something about loyalty and time and the cost of long absence that goes straight to the place in the reader that knows about these things. Odysseus, keeping his disguise, does not react. He turns away so no one sees his eyes. Inside, Penelope hears reports about the beggar and summons him. She wants to ask him about Odysseus. Wandering strangers sometimes bring news. They speak, and the scene between them is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary in the poem. Odysseus, still disguised, sits with his wife, answers her questions, and tells her, in an invented but carefully constructed story, that he has met Odysseus and that Odysseus is alive and coming home soon. Penelope weeps. She has heard versions of this story before, from other wanderers, and she has learned not to trust hope too easily. She asks him to describe the Odysseus he supposedly met, and Odysseus describes himself with an accuracy of detail. The clothes he was wearing on a specific occasion, a brooch with a particular design, that nearly breaks her. She believes the physical description. She does not know she is talking to the man being described. She tells the old nurse, Eurycleia, to wash the beggar's feet, a traditional act of hospitality for a guest, and an intimate one. Eurycleia takes the old beggar's foot, begins washing, and feels a scar on his thigh. She knows this scar. She was his nurse when he was a child. She was there when he got it, from a boar's tusk on a hunting trip with his grandfather Autolycus as a young man, long before he was famous for anything except being Laertes' son. She recognizes him instantly. Her hands go still. She looks at his face. He looks at her. He grips her wrist and whispers urgently, "Not yet. Not a word. Not to anyone." Eurycleia, shaking, weeping silently, finishes washing his feet and keeps his secret. Penelope, who was distracted at the moment of recognition by Athena's careful management of where she was looking, does not notice any of this. She speaks to the beggar a little longer, tells him about a dream she had, the eagle and the 20 geese again, and still she cannot be certain what it means, and goes to bed. Odysseus stays in the hall. He is awake late, turning things over, watching the serving women who have been disloyal to the household, slipping out to spend the night with suitors, making his calculations. He does not sleep until almost dawn, and even then, only briefly. The day of the contest is coming. Chapter 17. Part 2. The Bow of Odysseus. The bow has been in storage since Odysseus left for Troy. It is an extraordinary weapon, a gift, years before the Trojan War, from a Spartan nobleman named Iphitus, a composite bow of unusual power and craftsmanship. Before he left for Troy, Odysseus left it at home, in its case, oiled and maintained, along with its quiver of bronze-tipped arrows. A great bow is not taken to a siege. The fighting at Troy was infantry work, close and brutal. The bow belongs to a different kind of warfare, the kind you do at home, on familiar ground, against opponents you have chosen the moment to face. Penelope announces the contest. She will marry whichever suitor can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through the axes, through the rings of 12 axe heads set in a line, a target that Odysseus himself used to hit with practiced ease, but which requires first stringing the bow, which is itself a feat of considerable strength and skill. She brings the bow from storage herself, and the poem pauses for a moment on her grief at handling it. The weight of it, the associations, the way an object used by someone you love becomes a kind of presence, a physical record of them. Then she takes it into the hall and sets the contest in motion. The suitors try. One by one, they attempt to string the bow. They heat the limbs by the fire. They oil them. They strain and grunt and fail. The bow will not bend for them. Not one of the 108 men in that hall can string Odysseus's bow. Odysseus, watching from his seat in the corner as the old beggar, asks if he might try. There is laughter and mockery from the suitors. A beggar touching the great bow, the presumption of it. Telemachus, who knows exactly what is about to happen, handles the moment with a new authority that the poem has been carefully building in him. He insists, with a firmness that is slightly surprising to everyone, including perhaps himself, that the beggar be allowed to try. The bow is passed to Odysseus. He examines it. He turns it in his hands, checking for damage, for warping, the way a craftsman examines a tool he knows well. The suitors watch, making jokes about this old man inspecting a bow he obviously cannot string. Then he strings it, easily, without visible effort. The way you do something you have done 10,000 times. He plucks the string, and it sings out a note, a pure, high note, like a swallow's call. Homer says, and the sound of it goes through the hall. The suitors, as one, feel the quality of the silence that follows. Telemachus has already armed himself. He stands. Odysseus takes an arrow, sets it to the string, draws, and shoots through all 12 axes. Then he sets down the arrow. He looks across the hall at the suitors with the eyes of Odysseus, not the beggar, and he says to Telemachus, "The contest is over." What comes next is not heroic in the sunlit sense. It is violent and purposeful and necessary within the moral framework of the poem, but Homer does not make it beautiful. Odysseus and Telemachus, joined by Eumaeus and one other loyal servant, fight the suitors in the hall of the palace. The suitors try to arm themselves and cannot. Telemachus has already moved the weapons. They try to escape and cannot. The doors are held. One by one they are killed. Antinous dies first, struck by an arrow as he is lifting a cup of wine to his mouth. The moment has the quality of unexpected justice, so sudden and complete that the other suitors cannot immediately process what has happened. The killing in the hall is not glorified. It is described with the same precision and detail that Homer uses for everything. But there is no celebration in the narration, no triumph music in the verse. These are men being killed in a hall that they have occupied inappropriately for too long. And the killing resolves something that needed resolving. But it is still killing. The bodies pile up. The blood runs across the floor. It takes time. When it is over, the disloyal servants are dealt with, the hall is cleaned, the air is purified with sulfur, and the house of Odysseus, for the first time in 20 years, belongs again to Odysseus. Chapter 18. The recognition Penelope has been kept away from all of this by Eurycleia, sent to her room, kept there, because what happened in the hall was not something she needed to witness while it was happening. When it is over, Eurycleia goes to her. She tells her. She uses the word, Odysseus. He is here. He has come. The suitors are dead. It's over. Penelope does not believe her, or rather, she cannot afford to believe her, not yet, not based only on this. She has heard too many wrong things for too long. She has protected herself by not hoping fully, and that protection has become a kind of instinct, and she cannot simply switch it off because someone tells her it is no longer necessary. She goes down to the hall. She sits across from this man who says he is her husband, who has been disguised as a beggar, but now wears the appearance Athena has temporarily restored to him. She looks at him for a long time without speaking. Telemachus, watching, cannot understand her restraint. He says, or something close to it, "Mother, your heart is too hard." There he is. He has come back. Are you not going to speak to him? Penelope says, in a reply that is one of the most intelligent things any character says in the entire poem. I am not certain. If he is truly Odysseus, we have ways of knowing each other that only we know. She is not cold. She is cautious in the way that 20 years of uncertain waiting have made caution into a survival mechanism. She cannot simply accept. She has to know. She turns to Eurycleia and says, "Take the great bed and move it out of the bridal chamber for him to sleep in." There is a fraction of a second. And then Odysseus erupts. Not in anger exactly, but in a kind of incredulous, urgent insistence that cannot be faked. He says, "Who has moved the bed? That bed cannot be moved. I built it. I built the entire bridal chamber around an olive tree that was growing on the spot. The living trunk of the tree is the bedpost, rooted in the earth. There is no one alive who knows this except you and me and one servant. If the bed has been moved, someone has cut the tree. Tell me, has someone cut the tree? He knows the bed. He knows its secret. He knows it the way you know something you built with your own hands, something that existed in no other form before you made it." And Penelope's restraint dissolves. The recognition is not managed by words after that point. Homer describes her legs going soft, the way they do when the body is overwhelmed before the mind has finished processing. She crosses the room. She wraps her arms around her husband's neck. She weeps. He weeps. They hold each other in the recovered hall of their own house after 20 years. Homer, who has spent 24 books building to this moment, allows it to breathe. He does not rush past it. He compares Penelope's relief to the relief of sailors who have survived a storm and finally see land, which is, in this poem, the most fundamental image of safe arrival, the thing that Odysseus himself has been reaching for through every page. The recognition scene works because the test Penelope devises is perfect, not as a trick, not as deliberate cruelty, but as the only test that could possibly be sufficient. The bed, the immovable bed, the bed built around a living tree and known only to the two of them, is a secret so specific and so private that nothing could reproduce it except the actual Odysseus. It cannot be guessed. It cannot be researched. It can only be known by the man who built it. And when he knows it, she can finally stop being cautious. She can finally put down the protection she has been carrying for 20 years. She can finally come home herself, in the way that people who stay come home when the one who left returns. They talk through the night. Odysseus tells her something of what happened. She tells him something of what happened here. The poem suggests they talked until dawn, equal partners exchanging their separate long ordeals, and that only when they had told each other enough did they finally sleep. In the morning, Odysseus goes to find his father. Laertes is in his orchard, in old clothes, bent over his plants, alone with his grief and his trees. Odysseus approaches, still not quite ready to reveal himself. One last disguise, one last moment of testing, but the sight of his father, aged and worn with 20 years of sorrow, undoes him. He weeps. And then he reveals himself. And his old father, who has been waiting longer than anyone and hoping less than anyone, staggers. Odysseus catches him. This moment, the son catching his falling father in an orchard, is one of those images the Odyssey offers that lodge permanently in the imagination. It is so quiet and so true and so entirely removed from heroism in any conventional sense that it feels like the poem's real ending, the thing it has been traveling toward more honestly than any other destination. The violence in the hall, necessary as the poem presents it, is not the return. This is the return. A man catching his old father in the olive grove of home. The families of the dead suitors, predictably, gather with weapons. There is a confrontation. Athena intervenes. Zeus intervenes. A truce is imposed. The world settles. The Odyssey ends. Not with a great battle, not with a triumph, with a truce, with a divine command to stop fighting and live together in something that will have to function as peace. It is, like many real endings, slightly provisional and slightly unsatisfying and completely true. The wandering has ended. The long occupation of the palace has ended. The reunion, husband and wife, father and son, son and father, has happened. The home has been reclaimed, not easily, not without cost, and not in quite the form it had before anyone left. There is a particular quality that belongs only to stories that have lasted long enough. Not the quality of age exactly. Age alone does not make a thing valuable, and there are plenty of ancient texts that survive primarily as scholarly curiosities, preserved in libraries and studied in universities, without ever reaching the place in a reader where stories actually live. The quality that belongs to the Odyssey is something different. It is the quality of continued recognition. Of a reader in the 8th century BCE hearing the poem performed around a fire and feeling something true in it, and then a reader in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE feeling the same thing, and then a Roman poet in the 1st century BCE using it as the skeleton of his own great poem, and then a medieval monk copying it out by hand without fully understanding the religion it assumes, and then a Renaissance scholar encountering it with fresh eyes, and then James Joyce building a novel around its structure in 1922, and then a student somewhere tonight reading it for the first time and feeling, with some surprise, that it is about something they recognize. That continuity of recognition is what we need to understand. Not just that the Odyssey survived, but why? What is in it that keeps finding its way into new readers in new centuries as if it were specifically addressed to them? That is the question this final part of the documentary tries to answer. Chapter 18. The Themes Beneath the Surface. The Odyssey is, on its surface, an adventure story. A man tries to get home. Monsters and gods stand in his way. He overcomes them through intelligence and endurance. He arrives. He reclaims what is his. This surface is genuinely entertaining. The monsters are vivid. The gods are compelling. The situations are dramatic and occasionally harrowing. If the Odyssey were only its surface, it would still be a remarkable work, a collection of the best adventure episodes the ancient Mediterranean imagination produced, strung together on the spine of a quest narrative that has inherent forward momentum. But the Odyssey is not only its surface. Beneath the adventure story, there are several interlocking themes that give the poem its depth, and which are responsible for the fact that it keeps speaking to new readers across new centuries. Understanding these themes does not diminish the adventure. It illuminates it. The way understanding the engineering of a beautiful bridge does not make the bridge less beautiful, but makes it more coherent, more satisfying, more fully itself. The first and most fundamental theme is identity. The Odyssey is obsessed with the question of who a person is and how identity is maintained across time and transformation. Odysseus changes constantly throughout the poem. He is disguised. He is aged by hardship. He is transformed by Athena's magic. He tells false stories about himself to nearly every person he meets. He is, for most of the poem's final section, literally unrecognizable to his own household. And yet the poem insists, consistently, that he is still Odysseus. Not a changed man. Not a person shaped beyond recognition by his experiences, but the same person, maintained across 20 years of absence and ordeal, recognizable to those who know him well enough, to his dog, to his nurse, to his wife, ultimately, to his father. This insistence raises a question that the poem takes seriously. What is the thing that constitutes identity, if not appearance, which can be disguised or transformed, and not circumstance, which has changed completely, and not even memory exactly, since others cannot access his memories directly? Then what is it? The Odyssey's answer, delivered through the form of the story, rather than through any direct philosophical statement, seems to be something like desire. Consistent, unchanged, unwavering desire. Odysseus is recognizable as Odysseus because he keeps wanting the same thing. Through every transformation, every temptation, every alternative that is offered, he wants to go home. That persistent direction of his wanting is what makes him himself. This is a remarkable thing to build an epic around. Most heroic narratives are structured around achievement. The hero gets stronger, performs greater feats, wins larger battles, accumulates more glory. The Odyssey is structured around persistence. Odysseus does not become greater in the course of the poem. He becomes more worn, more scarred, more reduced in external terms. He loses ships, men, time. He arrives home with nothing except himself. And the poem presents this arrival, this return with nothing except the self intact, as the real victory, greater in its own framework than any battle. The second great theme is temptation, and its relationship to the desire for home. Nearly every episode in the Odyssey presents Odysseus with an alternative to the journey. The Lotus Eaters offer oblivion, the ease of forgetting the whole enterprise. Circe offers magical power and comfortable company. The Sirens offer knowledge, complete, perfect understanding of everything. Calypso offers immortality and eternal youth. These are not trivial temptations. They are graduated, carefully arranged, each one more fundamental than the last. The desire to forget, the desire for power, the desire to know everything, the desire to live forever. And Odysseus refuses each one. Not always easily, not always heroically, sometimes with obvious struggle, sometimes with a grief that makes the refusal feel like loss rather than triumph. But consistently and ultimately, he refuses. The poem does not present the alternatives as bad. Calypso's offer of immortality is, by any rational calculation, objectively better than a mortal life. The poem does not argue with this. It simply shows Odysseus making his choice and holds the two things, the immortality offered and the mortality chosen, in deliberate contrast, and asks the reader to sit with what that choice reveals about him. What it reveals, finally, is that meaning, for Odysseus, and the poem implies for human beings generally, is inseparable from particularity. Immortality on a beautiful island with a divine companion is not better than Ithaca, because Ithaca is better in any abstract sense. It is not. Ithaca is small and rocky and full of problems. What Ithaca is his. Penelope is particular, not the most beautiful woman in the world, not divine, not eternal, but specifically and irreplaceably herself, the one person who knows the secret of the bed. The meaning of home is not in its qualities, but in its specificity, in the precise and unreplicable constellation of people and places in history that it represents. This is a philosophy of meaning that feels completely contemporary, which is one reason the poem continues to resonate. We still live in a world full of temptations structured like the Odysseys, offerings of ease, pleasure, distraction, oblivion, and the human challenge of maintaining direction through them, of knowing what you want badly enough to refuse what you're offered, is if anything more acute now than it was 3,000 years ago. The third theme is loyalty and its costs. The poem is full of loyalty. Penelope's loyalty to Odysseus, Telemachus's loyalty to the father he has never met, Eumaeus's loyalty to a master he believes is dead. But the poem is also full of what happens when loyalty fails. The disloyal servants who sleep with the suitors, the crew members who open the bag of winds, the men who kill the cattle. And the contrast between these two groups is not simple moral instruction, but something more nuanced, an examination of how loyalty is sustained and how it breaks down, what it requires, and what it costs. Penelope's loyalty, in particular, is presented not as simple faithfulness, but as an active, demanding, costly commitment maintained in the face of enormous pressure. She is loyal not because loyalty is easy or because it costs nothing, but because she has decided it is what she is, and she will be that through everything. This makes her loyalty not a passive quality, but an active one, the loyalty of someone who has chosen every day for 20 years to keep choosing the same thing. The fourth theme, and the one that ties all the others together, is the nature of homecoming itself. The Odyssey understands something about return that most stories about journeys either miss or soft pedal. Homecoming is not simply the end of the journey. It is its own ordeal. The returned traveler is not the same person who left. The home is not the same home. The people who stayed have changed, and the person who returns has changed. And the gap between the expected reunion and the actual one is its own kind of loss. Odysseus returns in disguise and must earn his own house back through the contest of the bow. He cannot simply walk in the front door and announce himself. The home he left has been transformed by his absence into something he must reclaim, not merely re-enter. The recognition scenes, with Eurycleia, with Telemachus, with his dog, finally with Penelope, are each separate acts of homecoming, each one requiring something from him. And even the final recognition, the one with Penelope, requires proof. Not because she is cold or unloving, but because 20 years of uncertainty has made trust into something that must be demonstrated rather than assumed. The immovable bed is not a test of his identity in some abstract sense. It is a test of whether the intimacy of their shared life has survived, whether the private knowledge, the things only two people know about each other, is still intact. It is. And that is the real reunion, not the embrace, though the embrace is part of it. The real reunion is the moment she knows that the private, particular knowledge of their life together is still held, still shared, still real. This is finally what the Odyssey is about. Not adventure, not monsters, not gods. The poem is about the private knowledge of a shared life and the extraordinary effort required to preserve it across time and distance and transformation. That is why it lasts. Chapter 19. The Odyssey Through History. The Odyssey entered Western culture so early and so completely that it is almost impossible to imagine Western culture without it. This is not a figure of speech. The poem was central to Greek education from at least the 5th century BCE onward. Children learned to read from it, learned rhetoric from it, learned the values and stories and language of their civilization from it. Homer was, to the ancient Greeks, approximately what Shakespeare is to us, except older and more foundational and applied to education, even more systematically than any single playwright has ever been in the English-speaking world. The influence on ancient philosophy was immediate and complex. Plato, in the 4th century BCE, had a complicated relationship with Homer. He quoted him constantly and knew him deeply, but also argued in the Republic that Homer's gods set a bad moral example and that epic poetry was potentially dangerous to a well-ordered state. This argument is itself evidence of how seriously Homer was taken. You do not bother arguing against things that no one cares about. The Stoics found in Odysseus a model of the sage, the person who maintains equanimity through every kind of adversity, who is moved by external events without being controlled by them, who keeps his rational faculty intact regardless of what the world throws at him. The Stoic reading of the Odyssey treats every monster and divine obstacle as an allegory for the passions and external circumstances that the philosopher must navigate. Circe's drugs as the temptations of pleasure, the Sirens as the seductions of empty knowledge, Charybdis as the violent fluctuations of fortune that can swallow a life if you sail too close. This allegorical approach to the Odyssey, reading it as a moral and philosophical text rather than a literal adventure story, was enormously influential for centuries, and it is probably one reason the poem survived the transition from the pagan ancient world into the Christian medieval world without being entirely suppressed. If the poem could be read as an allegory of the soul's journey toward virtue, or the Christian's journey through temptation toward God, it retained its usefulness even in a culture that was otherwise dismantling the mythological framework it was written within. Virgil, writing in the 1st century BCE, used the Odyssey as one of the primary models for the Aeneid, the great Roman national epic that follows Aeneas from the fall of Troy to the founding of Rome. The Aeneid is, in certain structural respects, the Odyssey reimagined. A wandering hero, a series of encounters with supernatural forces, a destination that requires endurance and sacrifice to reach. But Virgil's engagement with Homer is not imitation. It is dialogue and sometimes argument. Aeneas is in many ways the anti-Odysseus. Where Odysseus is driven by the desire for his particular home, Aeneas is driven by duty to a home he has not yet built, a Rome that does not yet exist. The comparison illuminates both poems. In the medieval period, the Odyssey was less directly influential in Western Europe. The text itself was largely inaccessible, since Greek was not widely read by European scholars, and what knowledge existed of Homer came mainly through Latin summaries and the influence of Virgil. But the stories persisted in transformed forms: the wandering hero, the faithful wife, the disguised return. These are patterns that appear in medieval romance literature in ways that suggest the underlying mythological grammar of the Odyssey had seeped into the culture through routes that are not always easy to trace. The Renaissance rediscovery of Greek brought the Odyssey back into direct circulation in European culture, and the humanist scholars who encountered it found in Odysseus a figure who embodied something important about their own intellectual values. The idea that the proper response to human experience is engagement rather than withdrawal, that the world is to be understood through experience and tested through action, that the intellect is not a retreat from life, but a tool for navigating it. The early modern period produced translations and adaptations that gradually shaped how the Odyssey was understood in each European literary culture. By the 18th century, the poem was central to the literary education of anyone who aspired to cultural sophistication. Alexander Pope's translation, published in the 1720s, brought Homer to a wide English-language audience and was itself considered one of the great achievements of English poetry, even by people who argued that it was more Pope than Homer. In the 19th century, Tennyson wrote Ulysses, a dramatic monologue in which Odysseus, returned to Ithaca and restless in old age, announces his intention to leave again, to keep sailing, to keep seeking, because staying still is a kind of death. This is a fascinating reinterpretation. It takes the Homeric Odysseus, and makes him into a different kind of figure. A romantic hero of perpetual motion, for whom home is a trap rather than a destination. It is a great poem, and it tells you as much about the 19th century's idealization of restless masculine ambition as it tells you about Homer. Then came Joyce. Ulysses, published in 1922, uses the structure of the Odyssey as the organizing skeleton of a novel set in Dublin on a single day, June 16, 1904. The characters correspond to Homeric figures. Leopold Bloom is Odysseus. Molly Bloom is Penelope. Stephen Dedalus is Telemachus. The episodes of the novel correspond, loosely and often ironically, to episodes of the poem. The result is one of the most demanding, most admired, and most debated novels in the English language. What Joyce understood, and what his novel demonstrates through its very existence, is that the Odyssey's structure is not period-specific. It can be transposed to any time, any place, any social context, because the underlying architecture of the story is not made of Bronze Age particulars, but of human universals. The wanderer, the home, the waiting family, the obstacles, the return. These are elements that can be dressed in any historical clothing and still tell the same essential story. This was not lost on the 20th century, which found in the Odyssey a resource for exploring displacement, identity, and the longing for home in the context of a century defined by war, migration, colonialism, and exile. Writers from cultures far removed from ancient Greece, Derek Walcott in the Caribbean, Nikos Kazantzakis in modern Greece, Aimé Césaire in Martinique, engaged directly with the Homeric tradition, sometimes in celebration, sometimes in critique, always in serious dialogue. Walcott's Homeros, published in 1990, is a Caribbean epic that uses Homeric figures and structures to tell the story of a people whose relationship to the idea of homecoming is complicated by the history of slavery and colonialism, a history in which home was taken, not merely lost, and in which the journey back is not a physical voyage, but a cultural and spiritual reconstruction. The Odyssey, in Walcott's hands, becomes a text that can be interrogated as well as celebrated, whose assumptions about who gets to be the hero and who gets to have a home worth returning to are as important as its narrative achievements. This kind of engagement, this willingness to argue with Homer as well as learn from him, is itself evidence of the poem's vitality. Dead texts do not generate arguments. They generate footnotes. The Odyssey generates arguments, which means it is still alive. Chapter 20. Why Nolan chose the Odyssey. Christopher Nolan announced his intention to adapt the Odyssey with the kind of straightforward confidence that suggests a long period of quiet thinking, rather than a sudden decision. He is not, by any account, a director who makes choices lightly or randomly. Every project he has undertaken has been connected, in ways that become clearer in retrospect, to a set of preoccupations that recur throughout his work. The nature of time, the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality, the question of what a person owes to the people who love them, the moral complexity of intelligence used in extreme circumstances. All of these preoccupations are present in the Odyssey, which may explain why, when he finally arrived at it, the choice felt inevitable to people who know his work. Nolan's films are often structured around concealment and revelation, the slow uncovering of a truth that was present all along but not yet visible. Memento is constructed so that the audience experiences a version of the protagonist's inability to form new memories. The prestige is built around a secret that restructures everything you thought you understood about the story. Inception withholds information about its own reality until the audience is uncertain what frame of reference to trust. Even Oppenheimer, his most overtly historical film, is structured around what was known, what was understood, and what was withheld, and by whom and when. The Odyssey offers this structure naturally. Odysseus is disguised. He is concealed. He observes before he acts. The audience of the poem knows who he is, knows he is the beggar in the hall, knows that Penelope is talking to her own husband. And this knowledge creates a sustained dramatic irony that operates across the entire final third of the poem. Nolan has used this kind of dramatic irony, the audience knowing something a character does not or does not yet, throughout his career. The Odyssey's structure fits his instincts precisely.